This is going to be we'll start more of a fireside chat style, and then we'll go into questions from the floor. We have approximately 45 minutes for us to have an in-depth discussion. And what I would like to do first is we're going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. And we're going to ask them to also share a little bit about the relationship of their role to the data sustainability. So I'll do that in a moment. I really wish we had some more light. Do you think they can do it? You're awesome. Thank you. So data sustainability, what? I actually wrote that for us to have this conversation today, we should think about data sustainability defined as, I quote, the proactive and principled approach to ensuring bioinformatics research data remains fair, ethically managed, and valuable for future generations through sufficient infrastructure, funding, expertise, and governance. So we're thinking about all of these things today while we have this conversation. And we think that this is, the need for understanding what we can do individually, together, as a group, is now more than ever an acute and pressing need. We need to make sure that data can be efficiently preserved, shared, and reused so that we can accelerate discovery in every corner of the world. Of course, we have had a conversation that discusses this under the light of what has been happening in the United States, but is not a one single process in one single place. And so each of you will have 3 minutes to introduce yourselves and share with us your role in data sustainability. And then we'll get into the questions. So I'll have some questions to give you, and we'll just go through them over here on side of the fire, beautiful, that we have here. And then we'll open, oh, thank you, wonderful team. And then we'll go and open the floor for discussions. I'm sorry, I did not start with me. I'm Mónica Muñoz Torres, and I'm at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. I am the lead for the standards topics on the Bridge to AI consortium, and also the co-lead for the clinical and phenotypic data capture work stream for the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. And then let's start from the side. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm Scott Edmunds. I'm editor-in-chief of GigaScience. It's a journal that publishes data papers, software papers, things bringing it all together. We launched at ISMB 13 years ago, so we always have our birthday parties here. Plug for the party immediately after this. So this is a model, right? Data publishing is a sort of perspective I can bring and talk about more later. I have a lot of other hats. I'm on the advisory board of Dryad repository. That's an approach I can talk about. Make data count, looking at data metrics and tracking and stuff. So I can talk about that if that's useful. I've set up a citizen science NGO in Hong Kong, and I can kind of have a nerdy data perspective from there. I'm based in Asia, and hopefully can kind of give a global perspective. I was like quite a few other people in the audience. I was one of the authors on the original FAIR data paper, and I've also taught data management and curation at in Hong Kong University, so I can say a little bit of stuff there. So yeah, hopefully I can bring a bunch of perspectives. Yeah.
Chris Mungall. So if you heard my talk this morning, you'll know a little bit about some of my work with knowledge bases. So I actually got started in bioinformatics around about the time when I moved to Berkeley, and I actually joined the early Drosophila genome sequencing project. And that was done as a part of the Flybase model organism database. I've always been involved with model organism databases, part of the Alliance of Genome Resources. Outside my NIH hat, though, I'm also involved with a number of Department of Energy funded data repositories. So I'm part of the DOE National Microbiome Data Collaborative, which is an environmental microbiome omics resource. So I'm wearing both a knowledge base and a data repository hat, if in NIH terminology. And I'm like all of us, I'm very concerned with data preservation, but I'm also, at the forefront of my mind is knowledge preservation as well. And with knowledge, it's less about just being an archive and being kind of like preserving that, it's a living resource that has to be, nurtured and maintained. And I'm also like very concerned about the social and human networks around these, as well as the knowledge graphs and everything else. And as I think many of you are aware, the Flybase project was funded out of Harvard. It had all of its funding terminated, and this included funding for Flybase and all of the various kind of like subcontracts, including from the UK on that project as well. So within the Alliance, we're kind of working hard to try and preserve that. But even if we manage to kind of like gather all of that data and harmonize it, there's still this kind of like key question about what happens to all that knowledge when this funding is lost. And then if people have to move away from that project, it's going to be, it's going to cost us, years, decades to kind of like get back some of that which we might lose. So.
Hi, so I'm Varsha Khodiyar. I've been a curator for most of my professional career, I think. So I've been involved in the HENC. I was involved in the Gene Ontology project. I then moved into scientific publishing, where I had held, I'm pretty sure, the first sort of data-focused role within publishing, which was working at F1000 Research. I then moved to scientific data, and I was their data curation editor for several years. I ran the recommended repository list, because one of the things we had at scientific data was you had to make sure your data was archived to a sensible place, ideally an INSDC repository, for example, if it was sequence data, before your paper would be published. And it was a very, it was a really good role, actually, because I saw papers being held up until we could verify the data had been moved to the right place. So I think that's why, so that work, I think, led me to being invited to join the Scientific Advisory Board for GBC. I've since left publishing, and I'm now working as a sort of data curator, but I find myself working in a large pharmaceutical, helping them to manage their what they call reference data, which is ontologies and control vocabularies, really, but it's reference data and master data, and but it's about data governance, and it's about standards governance, actually, and the kind of detail you need to do the data engineering to really make use of the data. So I always say to people, when I was in scientific publishing, I was focusing in on the F and the A of FAIR, and now I'm really doing the I in like great detail. But I see also how private industry uses our public databases and our public resources. And I think, it's really worrying what's happened in the States. Obviously, it's really worrying what's happening to our data. There's a whole piece as well. The reason I wanted to get into publishing was this whole piece about trust in science from a society point of view. And you have to be able to trust the data, you have to be able to verify. And that whole piece of, where I see society going, where people just don't trust the experts. And what can we do to resolve some of those things by maybe making sure we've got good data governance? I think you said this morning, Chris, trust is really important. And for me, it comes from governance at all levels. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Yep, so I'm Tony Burdett. I'm the director of BioFair UK, which is a new digital research infrastructure for the UK. I started in that role in March, so we're new, so please come and talk to us downstairs. Before that, I was a group leader at the European Bioinformatics Institute, running, amongst other things, with Guy, the European Nucleotide Archive. So I've been involved in lots of services, provisioning services directly and running them at EBI, and also sort of bringing them to bear on research projects through a number of initiatives that we've had at EBI as well. So leading things like data coordination, data management, sort of planning within grant-funded projects. So I've there's sort of three hats there, which is provisioning the services, using them in the real world in research projects, and now providing the digital infrastructure to sort of weave them together. I am also seeing this, listing my hats. I'm also, until at least the end of the year, the interoperability platform lead for Elixir Europe. So that, well, pick up your I baton from the F and the A, and pick up the I, and you know, thinking that therefore about it sort of interoperability of data. So spent quite a lot of time thinking about interoperability, but the I in isolation is not really very useful, where you need to put the FA and the R all together as well. So yeah, I spent quite a bit of time thinking about how to make sure that data services and data resources, as well as kind of the methods and the workflows and computational processes that take data from those resources and transform them and put them into other resources, all work together in concert. And Guy talked about the importance of thinking about the sort of wider landscape of GBC sort of resources and connecting them together into sort of sensible usage patterns. And so that's sort of the thing that we hope to bring through BioFair. How do you weave those services together into a wider fabric that actually solves some of the real world problems that researchers have, not just puts more resources into the pile. So that's me.
Thanks. So I'm Nicky Mulder. I'm African, and so I come from a slightly different perspective more recently, but I also come from different perspectives in terms of being involved in developing resources, and then also being the consumer and the submitter to repositories. So I worked at European Bioinformatics Institute for 8.5 years. I started off as a switchboard curator for 6 months. So that's when I met Amos many years ago. I remember going to Geneva trying to convince him that gene ontology was a good thing to put into switchboard. Because then I started running Interpro. So I ran the Interpro project for many years. And it was towards the end of that it really became apparent to me how hard it is to get funding for sustaining databases. We were looking for all sorts of funding to keep that resource going. Now I'm back in South Africa, and I co-lead a sickle cell data coordinating center. I lead an Alwazi open data science platform. I co-lead a data integration platform for a welcome center. So it's all about data and how we make African data more valuable and more visible. So the Alwazi Open Data Science Platform is part of the DSI, the NIH-funded DSI Africa Consortium, which is data science for health innovation in Africa. And there we're trying to make African data sets findable and then computable within the same platform. So so I've come from different perspectives, and the other thing we're doing so I ran HTA Bind at a Pan-African network for many years, and some of the products in that were African resources, so African databases, and some of them came about because of the reluctance of LMIC researchers to submit to public repositories. You feel you lose that ownership, the African perspective of that data. And so we've had to kind of have mirror databases like the African Genome Variation Database, which is very similar to NOMAD, for example, because of that. And we have this challenge of how we stay as open as possible, as public as possible, but still keep that, the protection of some of the kind of sensitive data. But I've also, as Guy said, I'm on the scientific advisory board for the Global Biodata Coalition, and I was for many years on the Alexa one. So I saw the resources being developed and become core resources through Alexa, and now trying to be supported long-term through the GBC. So I've kind of had a few different hats in that space.
Thank you, Nicky. I cannot tell you what a pleasure it is to have this collection of scientists here. I'm a big fan, and I'm very happy to have you all with us. The way we'll do is I'll ask some questions, and instead of us taking 5 turns at each question, we'll take 2, maybe 3, depending on, so be proactive, be excited, raise your hand or just grab the mic, and let's do that so that we have more opportunities for more thoughts. I know we could spend the rest of this week, and so what I would like to do is to take some effective approach in that way. And this is BOSC, the Bioinformatics Open Source Conference. So the first thought that I had was, all right, so how do we use this to our advantage? So beyond the code and publications, as we think about the principles and practices of open source and open data, how do we think we can leverage these things to build these more robust, community-driven solutions and the governance structures for the preservation, the long-term preservation of data and for accessibility?
I'll just talk briefly about the GA4GH. That's a community set of standards that is, really building the standards and the tools to be able to share data responsibly. So even if it doesn't sit in a public repository, but if it still applies to those, you can actually use these to make the data more valuable, more interoperable, more findable, and shareable in a very ethically responsible way. So that's just one of the community, open community standards, and then they're completely open. And that's what's great, is that the global community can contribute to and use those standards.
Yeah, I agree with it. Just a little build I'd make is absolutely community standards, but also community validation that data meets those standards. Because I think at the moment we kind of outsource that to journals. I'll just leave that there.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I also want to just promote something called the O3 guidelines. This is not O3 as in the language model, but this is open standards, open data, open governance, I think. So this is a framework developed by Ben Guri and Charlie Hoyt, who I think many of you know. If you just kind of Google it, it's got there's a Nature Scientific Data paper on this. And I think it's just a really nice, simple framework with some guidelines that data repositories or knowledge bases can implement that will guide them towards kind of like processes that help make it easier for the community to contribute and make things be such that there's less of a single point of failure in developing those resources.
Thank you. Is that cool? Do you feel comfortable? We can. Okay. So as I think that's very insightful. I wish I was taking notes. Is this being transcribed? As I think of other principles, it comes to mind, of course, we've been talking about a fair amount today. There are also the care principles, and these are foundational and very crucial guidelines. And so I wrote a question thinking these are focused usually on the immediate sharing and reuse of the data. And so are there any ways in which you think that following the FAIR principles and the CARE principles have given us some like practical limitations or have challenged the way in which we try to ensure long-term sustainability and just in general evolving reusability? Do you have some thoughts on that and what those gaps are? What could we do about it? Good, Varsha. Thank you.
I think the FAIR principles have been misinterpreted to mean open data. Like when we say fair data, it does not equal necessarily open data. Closed data can still be fair data. And I think this is something that's been unfortunate over the years. The other thing, I think the FAIR principles are great as far as they go, but they miss out the governance piece. And I think that's where you've then got something like the CARE principles have come in. I actually think when I read the CARE principles, I appreciate, I appreciate the context under which they were created, but I actually think that they're applicable to all humans. Everyone who has data on them should have assurance that their data are being governed well with all of the context of what the CARE principles say. So that's my those are my views, very personal views.
Yeah, I think what I was going to add was, I think as soon as you start adding sort of guiding principles and extra things to do, it does create some burden, right? And the question is not really whether that's the right thing to do, but whether it is the right thing to do. But you have to recognize that there's a cost to it, right? So of course, adding more guidelines, I'm thinking specifically about FAIR, but it sort of applies to CARE as well. I think if you add extra stuff to do it comes with a cost, and usually it's the right thing to do. But you need to think about the cost, and you need to think about the potential benefits. And they say if you want to go far, go together. If you want to go fast, go alone. And the tendency, I think, is to always think about the quick outcome, the quick outputs, and not the long-term sustainability. And once you start to think about long-term sustainability, you are moving in the right direction, but there is an additional cost to it that you then need to account for. And so to think that you can go as fast as you can before, or as cheaply as you can, or that you can continue to use all your funding on research outcomes and not actually put some of it into long-term sustainable infrastructure, I think that's a fallacy.
in defense of FAIR, like they were, it was deliberately kept very vague, and it's not a checklist. It's principles to kind of think about, and hopefully that gives it it means that people can read too much into it and think it means open data, and there's a huge number of all of these FAIR for research software, FAIR for FAIR workflows. I mean, there's all of these kind of add-ons and things like that, but hopefully at least FAIR will have a longer term use, because it is not it won't become outdated in the ways that like very specific checklists like MinSeq or something for like, you know, RNA-seq data or something does. You know, the life expectancy of things like that is very short, but FAIR, it's yeah, I think we shouldn't be held back too much by it, because it was deliberately to be just a sort of guiding principle. So
Chris, Nicky, you good? Okay. Before I open the floor for more questions, one other thing that I thought that I wanted to consider when I was thinking about data sustainability as we look into the future, I wanted to ask you for your opinion on what do you think are the essential skills and the training and the career paths that we need in order to cultivate this next generation of data stewards, right? The curators, the bioinformaticians who are going to effectively practice and champion the sustainability. Is there some roles that we can identify, and maybe how can the academic bodies actually build this capacity? I'd love to hear some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think we need these the greater recognition of data stewards and biocurators. So they are, the Biocuration Society has done a fantastic job at recognizing that as a field, but in academia, it's not recognized as a normal, job description. So you have data stewards, but those are the guys who sit in the library, and they don't apply to like specialist data stewards, specialist data curators. And we don't have a curriculum for it. We don't have an undergraduate degree. We don't have a postgraduate degree. We don't have a postgraduate diploma or even professional development for them. So we need to have, and I know there have been efforts in Alexia actually to develop curricula in data stewardship. So I think those are the things that academic institutions need to recognize are actually now core parts of big research projects. So if you're going to be generating big data, one of the core people on your staff should be a data curator, or at least your student needs skills in data curation. The other thing which we don't always recognize is bioethicists, because actually you really need a lot of bioethicists to ensure that you have data used in an ethical way, and they tend to be in their own kind of health science faculty department and not really infiltrating everybody else's projects enough. So I think that's just a missing skill.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to that, because applause from me as well. Just exactly that, and the other thing, I mean, what I wanted to add to that was there are programs, like, as you say, like at Elixir. It's something we've been thinking about in BioFair as well, about how to sort of professionalize those kind of research technical professionals, and I think not just recognizing it as a valid career path, but also recognizing that in big scientific projects now, you actually need leadership around these things as well. So, quite often you see data stewards or research software engineers embedded in academic settings, and they're the geekiest person in the lab, and they get all the jobs. So set up a database, make sure you've captured all the metadata in a spreadsheet. Oh, we've heard about these ontology things. Can you figure out how they work? How do you submit to ENA? They get sort of just constant under the pump of sort of vaguely technical requests, and actually thinking about planning for that stuff as part of your initiative, as part of your project, rather than reactively throwing tasks at the geekiest person in the lab, I think is really, really important. So I think there's the career track that you need, but you also need to recognize that you need leadership at the top level in these kind of projects, not just career development tracks for the junior people.
So I think one of the key things is interpersonal skills and sort of stakeholder management, and what we call soft skills. Because curators, I really loved your slide earlier, Chris. Curators do so much more. They bring people together, they bring different viewpoints together, and that itself is a skilled thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do. So I think, if there's anything that we can do we've got curators, like could, I don't know, by Curation Society put together, this is how you change management programs, or, how to deal with difficult people, because that's a really normal thing that curators have to deal with all the time. The other thing I think is often curators are translating between the very technical people and certainly when I see, and the business-minded people, and you're translating, this is what the technical folks need, this is what the business folks need. How do we bring that together to get to a place where we can now give the data engineer, this is what you need to do to make this data set work? So, yeah.
Thank you. Well, then I'm going to walk with a mic on the floor, and then we'll keep one over here. Do we have any questions for the panel? Yes, thank you. Could you please pass the mic down?
Thanks. I'm Richard Shorman. I'm at the National Library of Medicine in the United States. I'm going to express my opinion. This has nothing to do with any policy or position of NIH or the federal government. We talk about, like when we're thinking about sustainability of the resources that we manage, we talk about how do we demonstrate value and impact and that kind of thing. And, we can think about citations and all those standard metrics, but I wonder if we did an ablation experiment, and we've done this as a thought experiment. Like, what would happen if GenBank shut down, or the INSDCs shut down, or PubMed, or PDB? I mean, these are thought experiments that I think we all know that would have a huge impact on huge swaths of society. But this might become more of a real experiment, not just a thought experiment. We're seriously having to make decisions about what resources do we sunset, what can we afford to sustain. But I don't know, maybe that's what it's going to take, is to demonstrate what impact it would have if we shut these things down. That's not really a question.
Thank you, then, Scott.
So we actually discussed that in one of the GBC advisory committee meetings, because it happened when I was at EBI. There was actually a case where everything shut down, the lights went off literally, and you could see which databases got the first queries, and it was quite clear how much people are using them 24/7. But yeah, we did discuss it once in a SAC meeting. I'm not sure how practical it is to do and pick up the pieces afterwards, but it would be very interesting to know, how many people are impacted if it's down for a day? How many people are impacted when it's down for 6 months?
Scott?
Yeah, I've heard this, I think, referred to as the Bedford Falls experiment, that, It's a Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart doesn't exist, and then how does that affect everybody else in Bedford Falls? But yeah, it's quite a drastic experiment, but wearing my Make Data Count hat, we just don't have quantitative data on any of this stuff, right? We do need, I'm a fan of randomized controlled trials and kind of like RCTing everything, and actually, because we tell people these are the good things to do, these resources are important, jump through these hoops to improve your metadata, but we don't actually have any evidence that of the impact and stuff. So there definitely needs a lot more effort on this, and the data reuse metrics are terrible. Simple things like data citation, that journals have been pushing it 10, 15 years, but then the whole system's broken down, and these get stripped out, the third-party vendors pull them out. Most of this data doesn't exist anymore, and so there's been efforts to create a new, basically it's like a passive-aggressive workaround where they got like $15 million of Chan Zuckerberg money to create this data citation corpus, mining and recreating everything from scratch just because data citations are broken. So just a plug for the Kaggle competition. There's this corpus. It's kind of messy. It's needs a lot of cleaning and efforts. But there's a $100,000 prize at the moment if you can solve this kind of data tracking, data citation problem. And I think I'm contractually obliged by Make Data Count to plug that.
I think I maybe too filled with existential dread at what you're saying, Richard, to properly answer. But yeah, just going back to what Scott was saying about quantitative as well. You know, I think for something like PubMed, it would be very clear, like if PubMed was to go down, the entire scientific community would, like, you know, ground to a halt. But for some smaller resources, it can be harder to make that kind of argument. Like if the cell ontology was to stop adding new terms tomorrow, it wouldn't have the same kind of impact, but there would be progressive like waves of bad effects of that happening. But you can actually do some kind of quantitative studies. So people have done this with the gene ontology, where they have done a comparative analysis of analyzing their gene sets using the latest version, using the version 5 years ago or 10 years ago or something like that. And the results are quite striking. You do get, it's not like the previous results are wrong, but they're missing kind of like key insights, and they're, you know, you don't get the same insights into your experiments. That's not quite as compelling as not being able to search the literature, you know, all of a sudden. But I think, you know, we can maybe look to doing more of these kind of like quantitative analyses where you can actually do the comparison side by side and see what actual results you get on your data with the older version and newer version.
Well, you know, with all these AI tool demonstrations, I was thinking about, well, what if they didn't have PDB, or what if they didn't have all these resources? What kind of results would they be getting?
Absolutely, yeah. And maybe more, the AI companies could be doing more to kind of like step up and advocate, because let's face it, the US government isn't listening to us, but they, you know, they are listening to the AI companies, and they are absolutely dependent on this kind of labeled data.
Hi, I'm a PhD student and English is not my native tongue, so please excuse my difficulties in articulating my question. I guess coming back to the issue of educational tracks and trying to foster like new generations of, I guess, data stewardships, right? In the absence of institutional means of doing that, right, do you see avenues for maybe making this possible anyways? I mean, the last thing in that regard that came to mind is we do have a students' council present at this very conference, right? And do you see maybe ways that from like both as a pull and as a push model, the existing histories and institutions could maybe provide that anyways, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's very clear, and I'll go first, and maybe hand over to Nicky. So, so from a biofair perspective, this is indeed what we're trying to do. So we've launched a fellowship program, and we're trying to put together sort of initiatives to bring research technical professionals together across universities in the UK to try and build out these kind of networks of knowledge sharing and expertise building, and sort of create programs for people to share their skills and come together and work on things in a collaborative rather than necessarily within their university. And we hope that, you know, as you put those groups together, people will take their learnings back to their institution and maybe create a sort of race to the top rather than a race to the bottom, you know, and actually try and push those standards forwards. And some of that in biofair, you know, I'm very inspired by, I worked with Nicky on the Al-Wazi project previously, and some of the events that I was part of there and help run in terms of bringing researchers from across Africa and sort of supporting each other, shared hackathons, these kind of training development initiatives where you're bringing together people from a huge variety of initiatives, are sort of really empowering for that cohort of people who maybe are the geekiest person in the lab, and they don't know that there's hundreds of other geekiest persons in the lab stuck out there who are also thinking, I wonder if someone solved this problem before, you know. So actually creating those connected networks is a really powerful tool, I think.
Yeah, so we run these data jamborees, and that is to get people to make their data fair. Basically, it's they have a fair maturity model. But the other thing we do is through Actually Bandit and now through Al-Wazi is we actually run a research data management course. So instead of trying to have an entire degree in how to do this, we do professional development. So we run an online course. It's just finished now, and that's for anybody on the continent to join. So that's the basics of research data management, fair, you know, data curation and things. And then we've also just developed a standard curriculum for the Africa CDC for pathogen surveillance for public health. And in there, we specifically put data curation, submission, ontologies, you know, all of these sort of key things around research data management, so that it's not your full-time job, But whatever you do, you're totally aware of it. So it's for the public health staff, for the clinicians, for the clinical researchers, and for the students.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'd like to reflect back on the comments on fair and care and oh yeah, sorry, yeah. So the comments on fair and care, and it's absolutely true that fair, of course, doesn't mean open necessarily, but in terms of the fair principles being aspirational, many people do have an aspiration to be open as well, and certainly at this conference, it's a theme, but for the I think probably the most heavily used data resources, certainly the GCBRs, where it's a requirement to be open. Open is a very important aspiration. So the question is open or is open data in any way a problem for delivering data sustainability?
I think, yeah, that's a really key thing, isn't it? And I quite liked Amos's talk yesterday, was it? Just maybe there's different models for different types of use. And that's how you try and, make these things sustainable. Open is, of course, that's the ideal. That's what we're trying to do. But you want it open for the long term, not for a short time, and then the lights have to go off because we can't afford it anymore. So I think, we're going to have to be pragmatic here, as much as it pains me to say that.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one because it's no less valuable if it's not open. And so we always say as open as possible, as close as necessary, because it's within, for human data, obviously it's with the consents. With all these new data privacy laws, you've had the GDPR for a while, we're getting these all across Africa. You're not going to be able to have data sets open and movable. So the data sustainability problem actually becomes even bigger, because now you're trying to sustain data that's across many places, who don't necessarily have the EBI skills in how to store, securely manage data. So now you're trying to distribute the problem. And so I think it actually, the not being able to make it open makes it harder to sustain. It makes it more ethical and more responsible and everything, but it makes it much harder to sustain. So I think it just does throw up a lot of challenges, but it doesn't mean it's less valuable. That data are still extremely valuable.
Scott or Chris?
So yeah, I mean, I completely buy the kind of like the practicality aspects as well. Once you move from like data into knowledge, it does become a little bit harder and more impractical to, just because knowledge is by its nature so heavily interconnected. It's not like a single standalone data set that you can just, stick a license on. Once one group in your knowledge network starts making some of their data, their knowledge available under more restrictive license, it becomes much more harder to link to it and reuse it. And so if we are going to go down that path, we really have to think how these models will work with a lot of these many more interlinked resources. And, obviously I've been going to BOSC for a long time. I'm hugely in favor of open data, but at the same time, I acknowledge, people like Amos who have a lot of experience in this field, people who are not here like Peter Karp, who have been advocating for other models as well. And, I think in this age where we are seeing a lot of our data being essentially kind of like hoovered up and exploited by a lot of these AI companies, we need to kind of maybe figure out mechanisms by which, they can actually start paying for their fair share as well.
It's fair. Tony?
I'll make a really quick point. I think we need to think about lots of different models, but I do think that we often think about individual resources being open or free or sort of fair, rather than thinking about the fact that many of those resources exist in a complicated sort of pathway workflow of research, and identifying one or two resources in that ecosystem that you have to pay for opens up a huge number of really complicated questions. Like, if I bought that data set and then combined it with that one, which is free, is the resulting knowledge that I've derived from that, is that open or not? I don't know anymore. So, I think we need to think collectively about workflows and pathways rather than just individual data resources. Locking down individual resources feels like a recipe for disaster.
Thank you. Radhika raised her hand, then you.
Thanks, Moni. This is amazing discussion. I had a question about sort of preparing for, let's say, 10 years or 15 years down the road when the data look different. So like some of you, when I started my career in biology, my protein, my Western blot was my big piece of data for my thesis. Well, I had some imaging too, but like now it's sequencing, it's grown and it's going to keep growing and it's going to keep changing. I think, and I don't have that foresight. So it's a two-pronged question in that, where do you think we need to go? And, what we have right now with Fair and Care, is that enough to get us ready for the future? But also from a sustainability standpoint, bringing back to climate sustainability, data storage, all of this, at what point does it become like a balancing act? And when do we start curating at the level of no longer storing some data?
This is it's a very good question, and from a publisher perspective, right? When we look at journals, right, there's a very high level of access, and the same with database at the beginning, right, and then it drops off rapidly, and then there's a very sort of long tail. So when DataCite first launched, they didn't like the word permanence. They preferred persistence, right? So it's just like aspiring to get to that heavy use part at the beginning, but not making a super long-term commitment for the small amount of reuse later on. But there's things like time series and things like that definitely need to be stored forever. But that most of the reuse for like a large proportion of the use cases is just that those kind of just being a bit persistent, you'll cover that. In terms of the like ecological sustainability and things like that, actually we do have a part to play in that. There's a nice poster downstairs about like caching results and how that saves energy. Data has so much value now, isn't like training data models. Why do we keep recreating these things? Why do we actually, there's an argument to store it. Gavin's talk about the DOME registry, right? Like reuse of models is super important. So actually having longer term hosting of things actually can, if you're doing it like in a clever way, has ability to be more sustainable.
Yeah, so I agree with that, but I also wanted to bring in the sort of human element, and Chris, you touched on this earlier as well. So I think we think about data sustainability and we think about preserving individual data sets like forever, and that's sort of archiving really, and the permanence versus like persistence is a great way to think about it. So I think really I think about sustainability more about people, right? About investing in people, because if you've got the people that created those data sets and have stayed up to date with the field and still feel a sense of ownership of them or still feel a responsibility, they kind of update them and they tweak them and they look after them and maintain them over time. So it isn't just a sort of I built this thing and it was perfect and I put a labor of love into it and then I froze it and hopefully it's still useful in 20 years time. And just in support of that, this is BOSC, so I can get away with using a comparison to agile software development. A lot of agile software development is about avoiding handoffs, right? So you sort of invest in processes that reduce the number of handoffs that you make. And actually, quite often we think about data sustainability as creating handoffs, right? Like, I've made this thing, it's perfect, I can give it to someone, they can use it, and they never need to speak to me. Right. And I think that's kind of the wrong direction to go in. We should be thinking about how to bring people together to work on data sets and collaborate on data sets and look after them. So really, rather than thinking about how do we preserve data sets and freeze them in time, we should be thinking about how we create the people networks and look after those so that data continues to grow and evolve over time instead.
We have one question here.
Hi, my name is Cam Dahlquist, and I'm from Loyola Marymount University, which is in Los Angeles, California. It's a primarily undergraduate institution, so not a large, we just got to be R2, you know, it's a big deal for our university. But I can also just give an anecdote, like when Yeast Mine switched over to Alliance Mine, I have an undergraduate research lab. We lost a year of work in my students trying to figure out how to use the API to do the thing that they'd already finished for our software. So there's very small things that happen that would never be recorded on NIH grants or NSF grants that is the effect of losing these resources. But what I wanted to do is just brainstorm a little bit about university libraries. So we have a great library, and they're really leading the push on our campus for open educational resources. And, you know, most libraries over maybe 15, even 20 years ago started, you know, digital repositories of their own to preserve publications usually for, you know, the people on their campus. But I'm wondering whether there's some type of model here where we can leverage our great university resources to help with this whole ecosystem of data. And, you know, there's a big, you know, obviously people on the stage know all about this, about changing from the subscription-based model to the open access model. But our libraries are out there trying to advocate, especially for a place like us where we don't have a lot of money to pay for publication charges. And so I think there's probably a lot of really brilliant library scientists that could be onboarded to kind of help us with, you know, micro solutions, like local solutions to this problem. Even to, I mean, I would think that, you know, subscriptions to data, like Amos talked about in his thing, like our university could certainly not support all the different data resources, but I know that I have colleagues that are paying for some data that are not open data. And that if we can kind of leverage our university system into saying, well, you're already paying for journals, can you help us pay for some data? You know, maybe that could be, you know, a way that could help with the sustainability, because the academic institutions are going to be there. Like, you know, there's a crisis there in education, but they're going to be there in the next 100 years. And so it might be a good place to start breaking down the silos on our campuses. Thank you.
So one thing that always worries me about using individual university repositories for data is because data are so varied. So I think one thing we might want to have is like a standardized metadata for, so articles being across all these different libraries in different universities across the world, that works because we actually have a standardized metadata format to find articles. We know how to find articles. We don't have this for data. So maybe that's a simple thing. We just have a standardized metadata format at very, very high level. We've like, you know, we have Dublin Core, and then it's about implementing it, use what we've already got. And then absolutely, it doesn't matter where the data reside. They can be governed locally, and that's probably the right thing to do. But at the moment, my worry is that we would never find these data sets.
Forgive me, we have like 9 more minutes, and I have that time for about 2 more questions, and I have neglected the back of the room. So I'm going to come back here to take at least 1 question. I saw a hand shoot right up, and then I'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Eva, and I lead one of the shared research facilities. We work at Liverpool, in computational biology, and we work with a lot of non-specialists and people that are not that keen on FAIR, either by lack of understanding or knowledge, or just because of fear. No? So I wanted first to ask you, what is the one advice that you could give someone like me that was with me, these non-specialists that need influencing all the time, to bring them aboard? And second, when you work in this type of environment and the resources are limited, usually there is a heavy underspend on data-related aspects with lack of research stewardship in place. How do we mitigate what Tony was mentioning about the handoff? Because that's the current scene. In the best case scenario, I will have influenced them enough to let me or let our team deposit their data and of course be open with the methods, but then that's it, handoff. Nobody's gonna be looking after that living resource. Thank you.
So we always talk about the carrot and the stick. And sometimes if people are really resistant, the only thing is a stick, as in there's some mandate somewhere. So maybe this is where journals are useful. Let's say they're not. But that's essentially it. There are some some people who will not do something unless they absolutely have to. Yeah, that's just from personal experience.
Yeah, I could go. So occasionally I talk to people about how fair is fair enough, right? So and quite often you find a sort of resistance to adopting open data or fair data, or actually doing a little bit of work to make your data more reusable from a perspective of this sounds like a lot of work and I don't have anyone who can do it, or the geekiest person in my lab is really, really overworked. You know, and so I think you have to acknowledge that there's a cost, and then you have to sort of try and find the point at which you're stumping up the right cost. So, you know, and then that makes you think about the benefits, right? What are the benefits? And if your benefits are totally sort of utopian, egalitarian, we want you to give away all your hard work to the rest of the community for no benefit to you whatsoever, then of course people are going to go, I'm not going to do that. You know, it's my funding and my future tenure is critically dependent on my research outputs, and if I just give all my data away to AI and it scoops me, then you know, I'm going to be fired. So, you know, you have to recognize that that's the reality of the ecosystem, the reality of the environment that people work in, and find the sensible trade-offs, right? So this is how fair is fair enough. So think about, actually, if you document your data well enough, even just a little bit of metadata, you might be able, your future self might thank you, or it might be easier to integrate your data with other people's data sets, or find collaborators. You know, what's the sort of touch point, what's the pressure point that actually gives you a sort of a bit of insight into what a really useful outcome for that individual in the context of their project and their domain really is. So, you know, I think it's not a black and white, you should just be fair because we want you to do lots of extra work, but we want you to be fair. We want you to invest a little bit in fair to make your life and everyone else's life a little bit easier.
Yeah, I mean, just 2 quick points on that. So we use 2 ways. So number one is it must be an incentive. And that incentive is also requiring the change of mind of the people who use the data. Are you acknowledging those people? Are you citing the data? Can that person put that citation on their CV? I think that whole mechanism would be really useful. The other thing I say is when people don't want to share the human data, I say, well, you use 1,000 genomes data. What if you didn't have access to that? What if they hadn't made it available? You couldn't have done your own research. You use these public databases. What if those were not available? So you're joining that club. So if you use somebody else's data, then they should be able to use your data. So it's a bit of incentive and a bit of a guilt trip.
Show of hands, how many more questions do we have? We have 1 there and we have 3. So I have a proposal with the very few minutes that we have. 1 question, 1 answer. So would you mind?
So there was a lot of discussion about, you know, our data being sucked up by lots of other organizations, pharma, model developers. But if we could persuade those people to care about sustainability, what would be a good model for working with those organizations to promote sustainability? What would good look like?
Who wants to take that? Chris? Tony?
What does good look like?
Nobody. What would good look like? I really like this question. Any ideas? Go ahead, Varsha. Do it.
I think you do have to engage, and yeah, we have to kind of ask people to put money where their mouth is. Like I think that's the only way to do it. And I don't know exactly what that model would be. I think that probably needs some investigation. There's the micropayments thing. There's the I don't know. Do you pay a commercial license to access certain database for a year or whatever it is? I don't know. That probably needs some work. I think actually in that case, we can even almost consider what's happening with the NIH and everything in our favor, because people are very worried. So this is maybe a really good time to have that conversation.
Thank you, Varsha. Martin?
Well, maybe just to add to that. So I guess there's kind of a theme, right? First, we've heard in a lot of talks that people are carrying on resources without funding, right? So that's happening. And yet at the same time, these data sets are so valuable that, like we see, they're getting scooped up, right? And then becoming in some ways closed, right? And so I guess that seems to be some kind of broken model and maybe same, right? Do we have any ideas how to crack that?
How do we crack that? Who has an answer?
I think if I knew the answer, I wouldn't be sitting here and I'd be extremely rich somewhere. I think there are lots of different models. I think we talked a bit earlier about sort of micropayments, or I do think that sort of I'm quite privileged to be involved in BioFair, which represents the UK government putting quite a lot of money into managing digital infrastructure in an environment where lots of data, lots of services already exist, and we're sort of stitching them together. And we talk about building a concierge service to that sort of stuff. So, it's really, we're sort of directing traffic and helping people find the resources that they need with money that's been put in by the UK government, and that brings a real tangible benefit. So a bit of money into the right place, and investing in the concierge staff in your hotel brings a huge benefit to all the services around it, right? So, and I do think about sort of microtransactions, perhaps not the right way, and you can draw inspiration from the music industry, right? Like, people don't buy individual tracks and put them on their iPod anymore. They just pay Spotify, right? And that looks after everything, and the money trickles back to the creators of the industry. Maybe not enough, but you're
going to cause a riot here. Thank you. Last but not least, one question, one answer.
All right, I'll try. Just an observation. So a lot of the conversation, the word sustainability has meant money going away and a service now turning off because the money has gone away. But I think a more interesting dimension and expansion of that is, why did that money go away? Why did we heard now that librarians don't know if it's valuable, researchers don't know it's valuable. And now when in the United States, a government is quote unquote attacking data sets, actually a government is actually a reflection of just general people who don't know why they should be paying for something. So I'm very curious about, when it's not only attacked by the money going away and a service turning off, but then as we saw today, maybe it's going away because definitions of ontologies have changed. And now the individual FAIR in FAIR, each one of those is attacked in a different way because somebody perniciously is wanting to attack something or not even generating a data set. So I love, in the future, maybe someone will react to it, to talk about sustainability much more than we have talked about it in the past 10 years of, we couldn't afford it, but thinking about sustainability in an era where data is newly under attack.
Cheers. Somebody wants to share thoughts? Okay, or over drinks.
Oh, that's fine. I can offer.
Tony wants to say something?
Okay. So yes, I mean, just sort of a final thought is, often we think about sustainability as need more money, but we should really be thinking about sustainability as a resilient network that can survive perturbations, right? And that might mean doing less and doing it in a more sustainable way.
Thank you. There are some good comments online regarding, somebody was asking, U.S. National Library of Medicine has limited funding, only supported by the U.S., although it serves the whole world. Any ideas to increase funding for NLM? Somebody shared some information about, should I share my data sharing myths? And somebody said, here are some nice thoughts on how to convince reluctant scientists to share. So these are online and you can look them up. I cannot tell you what a thrill it has been for me to listen to this. Thank you for, the work that you do to be stewards and superheroes of resources and their sustainability. Thank you for your thoughts. And thanks everyone for being here to listen to this conversation. Before I disband the panel, I would like to kindly ask you for a favor. Would you stand in your best superhero pose and we can take a photograph with everybody, if that's okay?